On my husband's 50th birthday, he called to tell me the party was canceled. I believed him for exactly 11 minutes, the time it took to drive past the restaurant he thought I'd never see. Through the window, I watched him raise a champagne glass to a woman I hadn't seen in 20 years. Our daughter wasn't there. His daughter was. And sitting beside my husband in the chair that should have been mine was the wife he'd had before me. I didn't walk in. I didn't call his name. I just stood there in the cold and understood for the first time in 23 years that I was the one who'd been left out of my own marriage. The call came at 5:47 in the afternoon while I was merging onto the interstate with a bag of wrapped gifts on the passenger seat. Nathan's voice had that particular smoothness he used when he was choosing his words instead of simply speaking them. "Live small change of plans," he said. "The restaurant had a pipe burst or something. Total mess. I'll just grab something quick with a couple guys from the office. Don't wait up." I asked if he wanted me to look for another place. He said no too fast, the way a man says no when he's already decided the shape of his evening without you in it. "Happy birthday," I told him. "I love you." "Love you too," he said, and hung up before I finished the sentence. I sat with the phone in my lap for a moment, the turn signal still clicking. And something in me, some old quiet instinct I'd learned to trust over 2 decades of marriage, told me not to turn the car around. I didn't decide to drive to the restaurant. I just never stopped driving toward it. Traffic thinned as I got closer to downtown, and I used the 20 minutes to really think in a way I hadn't let myself in months. Nathan had made partner at the engineering firm in March, and ever since his calendar had filled with dinners I wasn't invited to, and couldn't quite picture. I'd told myself it was ambition. Men his age reinvented themselves that way, sometimes new title, new energy, new hunger to prove something to people who used to overlook them. But there were other things, smaller things, that I'd folded neatly into that same explanation without ever really examining them. Chloe calling more often. Not to talk to me. She and I had always kept a polite distance, but to talk to her father low-voiced in the office with the door shut. Rebecca's name surfacing in conversation the way a name surfaces when someone has been careful to only mention it a little at a time so it never feels sudden. He'd say it lightly. Rebecca mentioned Chloe's having a rough semester. As if an ex-wife commenting on their shared daughter was the most ordinary thing in the world. Maybe it was. I had wanted it to be. I pulled into the parking lot across from Marchetti's, the restaurant Nathan and I had chosen together for tonight, back when there was still a tonight that belonged to both of us. I parked in the shadow between 2 streetlights and got out telling myself I only wanted to see if the pipe had really burst, if there really were workmen and yellow caution tape, and a manager apologizing to disappointed parties. I told myself a lot of things in those few minutes. I have always been good at telling myself things. The dining room lights were warm and gold through the front windows, untouched by any plumbing disaster. I walked along the sidewalk instead of through the front door, some animal part of me choosing the shadows without asking permission from the rest of me, and I found the corner table through the side window, the one Nathan always requested because he liked having his back to the wall. He was laughing. Really laughing, head back the way he used to laugh with me before laughing became something he saved for other rooms. Across from him sat Rebecca Lawson, hair still dark and glossy at 48, wearing a green dress that made her look younger than her age, and more certain of herself than I had ever managed to look in 23 years of trying. Beside her, Chloe leaned into her mother's shoulder phone, out clearly taking pictures of the cake between them. The cake. White frosting, gold script. Happy 50th birthday, Dad. There were 4 place settings. 3 people. 1 empty chair angled slightly away from the table as if someone had pulled it out and then thought better of sitting down. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment watching my husband's family celebrate a birthday that belonged apparently to more people than just the 2 of us. I didn't feel the urge to storm inside and demand an explanation. I didn't cry. What I felt was stranger and colder than either of those things, a kind of falling clarity like watching a photograph you've looked at 100 times, suddenly resolve into a different image entirely, one that had been hiding in the same lines the whole time. That empty chair wasn't waiting for me. It never had been. It was simply there because even Nathan in the middle of his lie couldn't quite bring himself to ask the restaurant to remove a fourth setting. Some small cowardly part of him had wanted it acknowledged, even if only as an absence. I turned and walked back to my car without anyone inside ever knowing I'd come. Dinner wasn't canceled. I was. I sat in the car for a long time after that engine offhand, still on the wheel like I was driving somewhere instead of nowhere at all. The parking lot lights buzzed faintly overhead. I watched moths circle them in slow, senseless loops, and I thought that's what I've been doing too. Circling something without ever landing close enough to see it clearly. I didn't cry and I didn't call him. Instead, I did something that surprised me. Even as I was doing it, I started remembering. Not in a scattered, frantic way, but methodically, the way I used to review quarterly reports back when I managed logistics for a living, looking for the pattern hiding inside numbers that seemed random on their own. 6 months ago, Nathan changed the passcode on his phone. He said it was a work security requirement, something about client confidentiality after a data breach at a competitor's firm. I remember nodding unbothered because that was the kind of thing that happened at his level now. Partners had responsibilities. Partners had secrets that belonged to other people's businesses, not their own marriages. 4 months ago, the Thursday dinners started. Client relations. He called them always vague enough to discourage follow-up questions, always ending late enough that he'd come home already showered and changed into the casual clothes he kept in his office locker for the gym he supposedly hid afterward. I used to tease him about smelling like soap instead of scotch. He'd laugh and say he took his health seriously now that he was 50. I'd believed him, because believing him had always been easier than the alternative, and because for 23 years believing him had mostly been correct. 3 months ago I noticed Chloe declining every invitation that included me. A family barbecue. My sister's retirement party where Nathan was invited as an honorary guest for old time's sake. Chloe always had a reason work a headache, a prior commitment, but she'd show up at his office instead or meet him for lunch on days I wasn't included, and I told myself that was normal too. A daughter wanting time alone with her father wasn't a betrayal. It was just love with a different shape than mine. I thought about the necklace. 8 months ago, Nathan came home with a small navy box from a jeweler downtown Sheepish saying he'd bought it as a client gift. Something for the wife of a man he was trying to land a contract with. Corporate gesture, he'd called it, the kind wealthy firms sometimes made to smooth a deal along. I'd found the receipt folded into his coat pocket weeks later while doing laundry, nearly $3,000. And I'd put it back exactly where I found it because I didn't think there was anything to find. Sitting in that parking lot, I understood I had spent the last year assembling a puzzle with my eyes closed, feeling each piece, deciding it fit simply because I wanted the picture to stay whole. I drove home slowly, taking the long way past the elementary school where Chloe used to ride her bike, before I ever knew Nathan, past the little coffee shop where he and I had our first real conversation about building a life together. The house was dark when I pulled in. I sat in the driveway another few minutes and then I went inside and did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the banking app on my phone. Not out of suspicion, not at first, just habit, the same way I checked the weather before bed. But once I was looking at the shared credit card statement, I couldn't stop scrolling. Restaurant charges nearly every week at places far nicer than the sandwich shops near his office. $200 here, $300 there. Always dinner hour timestamps. Always amounts too large for a solo meal or even a quiet dinner for two. I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't used since I left my corporate job, the same one I used to track departmental budgets, and I began entering dates, restaurant names, amounts. I cross-referenced them against Nathan's calendar, which he still shared with me from years ago when we'd coordinated pickups for Chloe's college visits, back when there had still been reasons for our lives to overlap on paper. The pattern didn't take long to surface. Thursdays almost without exception. Occasionally a Friday. Charges clustering around holidays that meant nothing to me, and everything apparently to someone else Rebecca's birthday, which I only knew because Nathan had once mentioned it offhand years ago, and I'd filed it away without meaning to the way you remember things about people who used to matter to someone you love. I didn't confront him when he came home that night close to 11, smelling faintly of garlic and wine, offering an apology for the canceled dinner that never once acknowledged where he'd actually been. I told him it was fine that these things happen, that I'd ordered myself takeout and watched a show. He believed me instantly the way people believe what's convenient and went upstairs to shower before bed. I stayed downstairs in the dark kitchen a while longer, my spreadsheet glowing on the counter, months of quiet transactions laid out in orderly rows, like something finally making sense after being deliberately obscured. I realized somewhere around midnight that I had stopped feeling like a wife waiting for an explanation. I had started feeling like someone building a case. Nathan was easier to read the next morning than he probably realized. He came down for coffee already rehearsing. I could tell the way his sentences arrived a half-second too polished. "Ran into Chloe last night, actually," he said, pouring cream into his mug like it was an afterthought. "Grabbed a quick bite. Small world." "That's nice," I said, and I meant it to sound exactly as unremarkable as it did. "How's she doing?" "Good. Busy. You know how she is." He kissed the top of my head on his way to the table, the same easy affection he'd shown me for over 2 decades, and I let myself feel it without flinching, because flinching would have told him something I wasn't ready for him to know. I made him eggs the way he liked them, the yolks just barely set, and I asked about his day, and I smiled when he complained about a client meeting running long. I watched the tension leave his shoulders as the conversation moved further from anything resembling suspicion. By the time he left for the office briefcase in hand, kiss on my cheek, he truly believed that his wife of 23 years suspected nothing at all. I gave him 20 minutes to be certain he wasn't coming back for a forgotten phone or a forgotten tie. Then I went into his office. I want to say I felt guilty. I didn't, not exactly. What I felt was closer to the sensation of finally being allowed to open a door I'd been standing in front of for months, hand resting on the knob, waiting for permission that was never going to come from him. The desk drawers were unlocked, which told me something on its own that Nathan had never imagined I'd look, because in 23 years I never had. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old warranty booklets, I found a slim accordion folder, the kind meant for receipts and tax documents. It was labeled in his handwriting, "Miss Business." I sat down in his chair and went through it piece by piece. Restaurant receipts, the same ones I'd already logged from the credit card statements, but now with handwritten notes on some of them, dates, names, sometimes just initials. RL appeared often, so did CP. I didn't need long to work out who those initials belonged to. There were hotel invoices, too. 3 of them, all from a boutique inn about 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with a spa and a vineyard view. The kind of place Nathan and I had once talked about visiting for our 20th anniversary and never had, because he'd said work was too demanding that year. Wine purchases from a specialty shop I didn't recognize, always 2 bottles at a time, always paid for on a Thursday. Parking tickets from a garage near Rebecca's neighborhood, which I only knew because I'd driven past her old house once years ago, out of nothing more than idle curiosity after Nathan mentioned she'd moved back to the area. And then near the bottom of the folder, a receipt from Marchetti's. Last night's receipt. 4 place settings, though only 3 guests had actually sat down to eat. The total tip included came to just under $400. Beneath the itemized list in small print was the name on the reservation. Parker Party of 4. Not office colleagues. Not a quick bite with Chloe. A reservation for 4 people made under our shared last name at a restaurant Nathan and I had celebrated 3 anniversaries in. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Folder squared drawer closed with the same soft click Nathan always used, and I sat in his office chair for a while longer, staring at nothing. Then I called Daniel Brooks. Daniel had been my accountant since before I met Nathan, a steady, unshakable presence through every major financial decision I'd ever made. He answered on the second ring the way he always did, like he'd been expecting the call his whole career. "Liv," he said. "Happy belated to Nathan. How'd the party go?" "It didn't happen the way I expected," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more than I intended because he went quiet in that particular way Daniel goes quiet when he's already begun calculating. I told him everything. The canceled dinner that wasn't canceled, the restaurant window, the receipts, the pattern of Thursdays and hotel invoices and parking tickets clustered around a neighborhood I had no business knowing so well. Daniel didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he exhaled slowly, the sound of a man setting down a coffee cup he'd forgotten he was holding. "Olivia, listen to me," he said. "This isn't random spending. Random spending doesn't organize itself around one person's schedule for months. This is systematic. Someone's been managing this very carefully, which means somebody's been counting on you never looking." "So, what do I do?" "Nothing yet," he said. "Don't confront him. Not tonight, not this week. The moment he knows you're aware, he'll either get sloppy in a way that hides everything faster, or he'll get careful in a way that hides everything better. Right now, you have the advantage. You know something he doesn't know you know. That's worth more than any conversation. And if I need it later, legally I mean, then you're going to want more than a hunch and a receipt," Daniel said. "You're going to want the whole picture. Find out where the money's really going, Liv, all of it. Then we'll decide what you do with what you find." I looked out the office window at the driveway where Nathan's car had been parked that morning. Sunlight now falling across the empty concrete, and I felt something inside me shift from wounded to precise. "Okay," I said. "I'll find it." Daniel came over 2 days later with his laptop and a folder of our joint account statements going back 3 years. The kind of thorough preparation that made me remember why I'd trusted him with my finances, since before Nathan and I were even engaged. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Nathan had eaten his eggs, and told me about running into Chloe, and we began pulling apart 23 years of shared money, one transaction at a time. "Here," Daniel said, tapping the screen after about an hour, his voice carrying the particular calm he used when he'd found something worth being calm about. "Recurring transfer. Small $600, first of every month going out for the last 4 years. Labeled personal. No further detail. To where..." He clicked through to the receiving account information cross-referenced against an old joint tax filing from years back that still had Rebecca's information on it from before the divorce was finalized, back when Nathan and I were doing our due diligence before marriage. The account number matched. "That's her," Daniel said quietly. $600 a month every month for 4 years. That's over $28,000, Liv. And that's just one line. We found others once we knew what pattern to look for. A payment to a property management company that turned out to handle a condominium complex 20 minutes from Rebecca's old neighborhood. Her condo fees paid quarterly going back further than the monthly transfers, almost 6 years in total. A separate stream of payments to a student loan servicer, not in Nathan's name, not in mine. but easily traced through a shared account number Nathan had apparently forgotten wasn't as private as he believed. Chloe's graduate school debt being quietly erased $200 at a time. Property tax payments for a house I didn't recognize the address of until Daniel looked it up and found it belonged to Rebecca, purchased 8 years ago. Financing partially covered by a loan co-signed. I felt my stomach drop reading this by Nathan. "There's more," Daniel said, and I watched his jaw tighten in a way I'd never seen from him before, not in 15 years of managing my finances through every high and low. 2 vacations, one to Charleston, one to the Outer Banks, both paid through a travel agency, both billed to a card ending in the same 4 digits as the one Nathan uses for business travel. Both trips include 4 travelers. I sat back in my chair and looked at the numbers spread across the table. Months of careful, patient documentation, revealing something I hadn't let myself fully imagine until that exact moment. He wasn't rebuilding a relationship with them, I said, slowly, understanding, arriving the way cold water arrives all at once and impossible to unfeel. He never stopped having one. Daniel didn't answer right away. He closed his laptop gently and folded his hands on the table, the posture he used when he was about to say something he knew I needed to hear even if I didn't want to. From what I'm seeing here, Nathan's been supporting Rebecca and Chloe financially continuously for at least 6 years. Maybe longer. I'd need to go back further to be sure. This isn't a man who reconnected with his ex-wife recently out of guilt or nostalgia. This is a man who never fully let go of his first family and built a second parallel life, funded quietly through money that was legally yours as much as his. I thought about all the small sacrifices I'd made without ever knowing I was making them. The kitchen renovation we'd postponed twice because the market's uncertain right now. The trip to Italy we'd talked about for our anniversary shelved indefinitely because Nathan said the firm needed him too much that year to take 2 weeks off. I had believed those were shared decisions made together for reasons that made sense. They hadn't been shared. They'd been financed elsewhere. "The birthday dinner," I said quietly. It wasn't the beginning of something. It was routine. Wasn't it something they'd been doing for years, and I just happened to see it this time? "Based on what I'm looking at," Daniel said, "I'd guess so. There are birthday charges from years back, too. Restaurant receipts around this same date every year going further into the account history than you'd expect for something new." I felt something crack quietly inside my chest. Not loud, not dramatic. More like the sound ice makes just before it gives way beneath your feet. A small settling that tells you the ground you're standing on was never as solid as you believed. I hadn't interrupted their family. I said half to Daniel, half to myself, testing the words out loud to see if they were true. I'd only interrupted the story Nathan told himself about what our marriage was. Daniel reached across the table and put his hand briefly over mine, the gesture of an old friend rather than a financial advisor. "Liv, I need you to hear this clearly because I care about what happens to you, not just what happens to your money. You need to protect yourself. Now. Not after a conversation with him, not after you've processed this emotionally now. Open accounts he doesn't know about. Redirect your consulting income somewhere he can't touch. Document everything you've found. Print it. Save it somewhere outside this house. Whatever you decide to do with this information, decide it from a position of strength, not from the middle of a conversation where he gets to control the narrative." Fear. I nodded, though part of me was still sitting in that restaurant parking lot 2 nights ago, staring at an empty chair that had never been meant for me, finally understanding it had never been empty by accident. It had been reserved quietly, patiently for a version of family that had existed the entire time beneath the one I thought I was living in. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Tell me exactly what I need to do." Daniel opened his laptop again, and for the next 2 hours, we didn't talk about Nathan or Rebecca or 23 years of a marriage I was only now beginning to understand. We talked about accounts and attorneys and asset protection, the practical architecture of a woman preparing quietly and without malice to stop financing a life she had never been invited to share. The next 3 days moved with a strange, controlled quiet, like the stillness before a storm makes landfall. Everything looked ordinary from the outside, while underneath everything was already shifting. I opened a personal checking account at a bank across town, one Nathan had never used and had no reason to look for. I called my 3 biggest consulting clients and asked casually if future invoices could route to a different account for bookkeeping reasons. None of them questioned it. I'd built enough trust with these clients over the years that a small administrative change barely registered as worth mentioning. I met with an attorney Daniel recommended, a sharp, unhurried woman named Patricia Voss, who listened to everything I told her without a flicker of judgment, only careful clarifying questions. She explained what I already suspected, that in our state, the money Nathan had funneled to Rebecca and Chloe over the years, using marital funds without my knowledge or consent, would matter significantly if things proceeded toward divorce. She told me to keep documenting. She told me not to say a word to Nathan until every piece was in place. I froze 2 joint transfers that had been set to recur automatically, the ones Daniel had traced to Rebecca's condo association and to Chloe's loan servicer, quietly redirecting that money into the new account instead. I told myself as I clicked confirm on each change that I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was simply declining to keep paying for a family that had never once acknowledged my existence. Nathan noticed nothing. He moved through those 3 days with the easy confidence of a man who believed his second life was still safely hidden behind the first. He kissed me goodbye each morning. He asked about my consulting projects at dinner, feigning the same interest he always had, and I answered him with the same warmth I always gave, because I had learned in a very short time how easily a marriage could run on habit alone. Propelled forward by nothing but muscle memory and the assumption that yesterday's trust still applied to today. On the 3rd evening, my phone rang just after 8. It was Nathan, and immediately I could hear something different in his voice, not the smooth, rehearsed tone from the birthday call, but something tighter, edged with an embarrassment he was trying hard to keep out of his words. "Hey," he said. "Quick question. Did something happen with the visa it's not going through?" I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I looked at the phone for a moment before answering, feeling strangely calm, the way I imagine a surgeon feels the instant before the first incision, not detached exactly, but focused past the point of hesitation. "Where are you?" I asked, though I already knew. "Dinner with Chloe." A pause just slightly too long. "And a friend." I could hear restaurant noise behind him. Glasses clinking, low conversation. The particular acoustic hum of a dining room I recognized because I'd stood outside its window 5 nights earlier. I pictured him stepping just outside the door to take the call phone pressed to his ear, trying to keep his voice low enough that his other family wouldn't hear the confusion creeping into it. "The card should be fine," I said evenly. "Try the Amex." He tried it. I heard him exhale the sound of a man expecting relief and receiving something else entirely. "That one's declining too. This doesn't make sense. We haven't had any issues." "I moved some things around," I said. Financial planning. Daniel's been helping me tighten up our accounts. There was a silence on the line that stretched long enough for me to hear a waiter's voice in the background, asking faintly if they'd like to try another method of payment or perhaps step aside to resolve it. I heard Nathan mutter something to someone, an apology, an excuse. The particular scramble of a man realizing his two carefully separated worlds were suddenly unmistakably touching. "Liv," he said, quieter now, stepping further from the noise. "What's going on? Did something happen to the account?" "Yes," I said. "What did you do?" I looked out the window at our backyard, at the garden I'd planted the spring after we got married, the roses I'd kept alive through 23 summers, and I thought about the empty chair at Marchetti's, angled just slightly away from the table, waiting for no one, because everyone who mattered was already seated. "I stopped paying for a family I don't belong to," I said. The silence that followed was different from the others, longer, heavier, filled with everything Nathan wasn't saying yet, because he hadn't fully understood what I already knew. I could hear him breathing, could almost picture the exact expression on his face, the one he wore when a problem at work suddenly revealed itself to be far larger than he'd initially assessed. "Olivia," he started. I hung up before he could finish. I set the phone down on the coffee table and sat very still for a moment, listening to the house around me, the refrigerator humming faintly in the kitchen, the wind moving through the maple tree outside the window. I waited to feel something enormous, grief maybe, or fear, or the wild unraveling I'd always imagined would come with a moment like this. Instead, I felt something closer to stillness. The particular quiet that comes after you finally said out loud, the thing you've been carrying silently for far too long. 23 years, I thought. And it took one declined card in a restaurant I used to love for him to finally understand that I knew. I picked my tea back up. It had gone cold, but I drank it anyway, and outside the wind kept moving through the maple tree, indifferent to everything that had just changed inside the house beneath it. Nathan came home 40 minutes later, and I heard the driveway before I heard the door tires too fast over the gravel. The engine cutting off mid-turn instead of gliding smoothly into park the way he always did. He came through the front door, already talking jacket, half off one shoulder, keys still in his hand. "Olivia, we need to talk about this right now." "I agree," I said, and my calm seemed to startle him more than any anger could have. He'd clearly expected to walk into a fight, something loud he could match with his own volume, deflect with wounded indignation, redirect until the conversation became about my reaction instead of his actions. Instead, he found me sitting at the dining table, a manila folder in front of me, my hands folded on top of it. He sat down across from me slowly, like the chair might not hold his weight, like something about the room itself had changed since he'd last stood in it. "It's not what you think," he said. "Whatever you're imagining right now, it's not that." "Then tell me what it is." I opened the folder and began laying items on the table between us, one at a time, deliberate as a dealer laying out cards. Bank statements with the recurring transfers highlighted in yellow. The condo association payments, the student loan records, the property tax documents for a house neither of us had ever discussed owning any connection to. Receipts dated across years, most bearing a reservation name he hadn't bothered to disguise. And finally, 3 photographs I'd taken through the restaurant window 5 nights ago, Nathan laughing, Rebecca beside him, Chloe leaning into her mother's shoulder, the cake between them glowing under warm light. Nathan looked at each item without touching any of them, his face moving through something I hadn't seen from him before, not the practiced composure of a man caught in a small lie, but the slower unraveling of someone realizing the lie had gotten too large to survive contact with daylight. Rebecca's had financial trouble, he finally said, voice low. Ever since her last business fell through, and Chloe begged me to help with her mother, said she couldn't watch her lose the condo, couldn't watch her struggle alone. I told myself it was temporary. Then it became a habit. Then it became... He stopped rubbing a hand over his face. I don't know when it became what it became. 6 years, I said quietly. According to Daniel, at minimum 6 years of transfers, longer for some of it. I know how it looks. Do you? I kept my voice level, though something underneath it had begun to tighten. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you built an entire second obligation using money that was half mine, without ever once asking whether I'd have wanted to help. And maybe I would have Nathan. Maybe if you'd come to me 6 years ago and said, Rebecca's struggling, Chloe's worried, can we help them, I would have said yes. I'm not a cruel person. You know that. I thought... He stopped again, jaw working. I thought you'd say no. I thought you'd feel threatened by it, or resent them, or resent me for still caring what happened to them. It felt easier to just handle it quietly. You decided my answer before you ever asked the question, I said. That's not protecting me from a hard conversation, Nathan. That's deciding I didn't deserve to be part of one. He didn't have a response to that. I watched him look down at the photographs again, at his own face, caught mid-laugh in a moment he'd believed was completely private, and something in his posture finally began to fold inward. The practiced ease he usually carried, draining slowly out of him. Olivia, please, he said. Give me a chance to fix this, to make it right. I'll stop everything. I'll cut off all of it if that's what you need. I don't think you understand what actually happened here, I said, and my voice stayed steady even as something inside my chest ached in a way I hadn't expected, a grief arriving late to a funeral it should have attended years ago. This isn't about the money, not really. Daniel and Patricia can untangle the money. This is about the fact that for 6 years you had a whole family you were quietly caring for, celebrating with financing, while I sat across the table from you every single night believing we were building something together. You didn't just hide an expense from me, Nathan. You hid a marriage. You had 2 of them running at the same time, and I was the one who didn't know she was sharing you. He reached across the table for my hand, and I let him take it for a moment, feeling the familiar warmth of his fingers, the weight of 23 years pressing into that small contact. Then I gently pulled my hand back. I slid off my wedding ring. I hadn't planned to do it there in that exact moment, but it felt suddenly correct, the natural conclusion of everything laid out on the table between us. I set it down beside the photographs, the gold catching the kitchen light. You didn't lose me tonight, I said quietly. You lost me the day you decided to build another marriage inside this one and let me spend 6 years financing a life I was never invited into. Nathan stared at the ring like he didn't understand what it meant, though I think somewhere beneath the shock he understood completely. Olivia, he said again, softer this time, almost a plea. I stood up from the table, leaving the folder, the photographs, the ring, everything exactly as it was. I'll be staying in the guest room tonight, I said. We can talk more tomorrow when you've had time to decide what you actually want to say to me instead of what you think might make this easier. I walked upstairs and closed the door quietly behind me, and for the first time in 5 days, I let myself cry, not from grief for what I'd lost. I realized somewhere in the middle of it, but from something closer to relief. The exhausting work of not knowing was finally over. 6 weeks passed before Nathan fully understood I wasn't going to change my mind. He tried in the beginning the way people try when they've never truly faced consequences before apologies. that circled back into explanations that circled back into asking for one more chance. He offered to end every connection to Rebecca and Chloe entirely, as though severing them completely might somehow undo 6 years of quiet betrayal. I told him that wasn't what I wanted either. Punishing Chloe for loving her mother or demanding Nathan abandon a daughter he'd raised wouldn't repair what he'd broken. What he'd broken wasn't fixable by subtraction. It required something he'd never once offered me across those 6 years' honesty freely given, before I had to go looking for it myself. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in late October in Patricia's office, with a folder of documentation so thorough that Patricia told me with something close to admiration that she rarely saw cases arrive this organized. Every transfer accounted for, every asset traced. Every year of quiet, patient betrayal laid out in a timeline that left very little room for Nathan's attorney to argue there'd been any ambiguity about where the marital money had gone. Rebecca discovered the truth of her situation not long after the accounts were formally frozen pending settlement. I heard about it secondhand through Daniel, who heard about it through a mutual acquaintance, in the way small towns and small social circles always seem to carry news nobody officially shared. Nathan could no longer quietly cover her condo fees. He could no longer make Chloe's loan payments disappear $200 at a time. The dinners stopped. The birthday celebrations Rebecca and Chloe had apparently hosted every year without my knowledge simply dissolved, because the money that had built them for 6 years was no longer flowing freely from an account I hadn't known I was funding. I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard that. There was a small, sharp satisfaction in it, sharper than I expected from someone who'd always believed herself too composed for anything resembling vengeance. But mostly what I felt was something quieter and stranger, not triumph exactly, but a kind of settling, like watching scales that had been tilted for years finally come back to level. Chloe called me once near the end of the proceedings, her voice tight with an anger I understood even as it stung to hear directed at me. She said I'd destroyed her father's happiness, that I'd been cold, and calculating that a real wife would have found a way to forgive and move forward for the sake of the family. Chloe. I said, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage, I spent 6 years being told I was part of a family your father never told the truth to. I'm sorry this is painful for you, but I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped paying for something I was never invited to be part of. She hung up without responding, and I didn't call back. Some bridges I'd come to understand weren't mine to rebuild. By the following spring, the settlement was finalized. I kept the house we'd shared for 2 decades, though I chose in the end to sell it. Too many rooms held memories I no longer wanted arranged around me daily, the kitchen where I'd made him eggs the morning after his birthday, believing his lie completely, the office where I'd found the folder that changed everything, the driveway where his tires had screeched too fast on the night he finally understood I knew. I bought a smaller place instead, a modest lakeside cottage 40 minutes outside the city, with wide windows that caught the morning light, and a small dock where I could sit with coffee and watch the water instead of watching for headlights in the driveway. I kept my consulting business, expanded it, actually taking on new clients now that I had time and energy that used to disappear into a marriage requiring far more maintenance than I'd realized. Daniel visited often, usually on Sunday mornings, always with 2 coffees from the place near his office that made the kind I liked. We'd sit on the dock and talk about nothing important, his grandchildren, a book he was reading, the loons that had started nesting near the far shore. It was easy in a way. Conversation with Nathan had stopped being easy long before I ever understood why. One Sunday, nearly a year after that first phone call about a canceled dinner, Daniel asked me the question I think he'd been holding on to for a while. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. The phone call, cutting off the cards that night, it was a fairly dramatic way to end things. I thought about it honestly before answering, watching a heron pick its way carefully along the shallows near the dock. No, I said. I don't regret the phone call, but it wasn't really the phone call that changed my life, Daniel. It was finally believing what my own eyes had been trying to tell me for months before that. The phone call was just the moment I stopped pretending I hadn't already seen the truth. Daniel smiled and raised his coffee slightly, a small private toast. To finally believing yourself. To finally believing myself. I repeated and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything in years. I think often now about that empty chair at Marchetti's, angled away from the table where Nathan's other family sat, celebrating a birthday I hadn't been told about. For a long time I saw that chair as an insult proof that I'd been excluded, replaced, quietly written out of a story I'd believed I was central to. But I understand it differently now. That chair was never meant to hold my absence. It was simply the space where a lie ran out of room to keep expanding. The place where 6 years of careful concealment finally had nowhere left to hide. Sometimes betrayal isn't the moment someone lies to you. It's the moment they become certain you'll never question the lie at all. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the people who hurt you. It's simply refusing quietly and completely to keep financing the life they built without you in it. If you've ever discovered a truth that changed everything you thought you knew about your own life, I'd love to hear your story. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you enjoy stories about family trust and finding the strength to walk toward the truth instead of away from it, please subscribe and join me for the next one. There's always more to tell.